Welcome to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Welcome to Means of Grace. In this important episode, Dr. Otto Harris, the Senior Pastor of St. Mark's United Methodist and the Interim Director of the Conference Comprehensive Plan of Equity, leads an important conversation on belonging, diversity, and inclusion with local diversity experts Veronica Calderon of Aldersgate and Fernando Little of Atrium Health. I know you'll learn so much from this conversation.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Means of Grace podcast from the Western North Carolina of the United Methodist Church. This podcast equips church leaders through expertise and examples. Every week, we feature local experts on a variety of topics from leadership to innovation and share examples of churches in our conference reaching their communities in new ways through missional engagement, fresh expressions, and much more. I'm your guest host, Otto Harris, pastor of St. Mark's United Methodist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, and interim director of the conference's Comprehensive Plan of Equity. Today's episode will focus on equity, justice, and hospitality. Our guests are Veronica Calderon and Fernando Little. Veronica Calderon is the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Aldersgate Continuing Care Retirement Community. She moved to Charlotte from Ecuador in 1999, and according to the Latin American Chamber of Commerce, Veronica has served on many local nonprofit boards and uses free time to volunteer. She believes that the best way to see the community grow is through volunteering, one of the greatest reward to make a difference in someone's life. Fernando G. Little is the Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at Atrium Health. According to the Gantt Center, he develops, implements, and monitors programs and processes that sustain Atrium Health's inclusion organizational structure. To me, he's a Renaissance man. He's a visionary man, a family man, extraordinary musician, and he's the minister of music at one of the greatest churches in North Carolina. I can't quite call the name of that church, but there's a connection between him and me. So welcome both to you, Ms. Veronica Calderon and Mr. Fernando G. Little.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with both of you this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. And I'll call the name of the church is St. Mark's United Methodist Church.
And there it is. Sounds familiar. Charlotte, North Carolina, 917 Glen Road. Come by and see us. Wonderful. Great to have you. Grateful. So I'll start just with the question. You both are diversity practitioners. How did you become engaged in the diversity and inclusion movement?
I'll acquiesce to Veronica first. She has a way more impressive trajectory in this space than I do.
Thank you, Fernando. So for me, it really just started when my family and I moved to the U.S. and that was in 1999. I've always, Fernando can tell you, I am the person who asks a lot of questions and the whys and the whys and the whys. So moving to the U.S., we first moved to Miami and it wasn't as much of a culture shock, but once we moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, I realized that we were treated differently because we looked different. And so from that day forward, going to high school, getting called names, it really just, instead of bringing me down, it kind of, it was lighting up some bulbs in my head on how via dialogue, I was going to make sure that people got to know me, but also that people did not do what they were doing to me to others. And so it's really where it all started. I'm the daughter of an amazing single mother who is a teacher. And just to see her work and day in and day out and, up to 3 jobs to make sure that we were good and that we were cared for, it's not hard to see the inequalities. It's not hard to see disparities. So really just growing into that, right after high school, I joined Wells Fargo. I was there for almost 13 years. And in that career, it was we ended up being Wells Fargo, but that was through different mergers. But being in banking also opened up my eyes to a lot of other things, to understanding people, to building relationships. But then also, I was always involved in something that had to do with equity, with inclusion. Every time I was always the person who raised their hand and say, I want to do this. I want to be part of that. And years later is how I met Fernando. Through a lot of the work that I did with Wells Fargo at the time around inclusion and community connectivity and giving back to the community is how we met. We were actually, not sure if he remembers, but we were part of a project called Nuevolution, the New South. And it was an exhibit at the Meat Museum of the New South that talked about the transformation of Latin Americans in Charlotte, Latin Americans in the South, but how also we've been able to help transform the culture. And so fast forwarding to now, I am at Aldersgate, but really I always look back at my roots. I always look back at my personal experience and how all of that shaped the person that I am today. You're absolutely right when you talked about volunteering. I serve on too many boards right now, but every single one of them really serves a purpose in my heart. I serve at the Board of Communities in Schools. And to me, that the path to education for kids is how we can change our next generation. It's how we can build a better future for our country, for our kids. And so a lot of that, if you wrapped all of that in a bow, it's who I am. And it's how I've built my passion for my work. And I hope that each and every day I lead with my passion in my heart and not by something, by anything else, but truly just that.
Wow, very good. That's great. That helps with understanding and you said a lot there, and I'm sure we'll come back and visit some of that during our conversation. Fernando.
Yeah, so Dr. Harris, I told you Veronica was amazing, and I do remember that moment I encountered her. It was at the Museum of the New South, and like she said, that passion was just shining through. And I said, we need her at Atrium Health. And I said, it's a long shot because at the time she's being modest, but she was running and leading one of the largest resource groups at Wells Fargo. It was the resource group for the Latino teammate or affinity for Latino teammates and Hispanic teammates, right? Veronica, you were leading.
Yeah.
And it was the largest resource group there. And she was just a very respected leader there. And I said, Fernando, this is a long shot, but you need her. And thankfully it was the right conversation that she came over. But when I think about how I came into diversity and inclusion and equity work, Pastor, to be honest, now that I'm a little older, not that I'm smarter, but I'm a little older, I realized that it happened when I was in elementary school. There was this program called Minority Achievement. And now I didn't realize what it was then. I just knew that once a month for about 45 minutes, I was taken out of the class and put around more kids that looked like me and to have a conversation, right? And it's like, I just realized that was in my early ages, the school systems and the school districts' first steps towards equity, or me having trying to meet me where I was as an African American male in the school district, and then at the time it was given the label talented and gifted African American male, and so I just realized that could have been my first introduction to diversity, inclusion, and equity. But we fast forward then to college. Before I realized that, there were groups in college like the Black Student Association or the Multicultural Student Association. And those organizations were there, again, to meet you where you were on that campus, on a campus that may have been majority white, but we're trying to meet you where you are and make sure you have what you need, level the ground so that you can contribute just like everybody else. Wasn't processing it that way, but that's how it was presented. And then before I realized it, in the professional world, I had just joined Bank of America in human resources. And that was right around the emergence of what they were calling affinity groups. And I was asked to attend a meeting by one of the banking executives, Gwen Thomas. I never forget her. She's a very prominent figure in the Charlotte community. Didn't know who she was at the time because I just started Bank of America. She said, I want you to come to this affinity group meeting. It was for African American professional group for bankers. And that's when I realized that this whole diversity infrastructure was taking place and had already taken place in some aspects of my life. And then I started to process, okay, how is this adding value? Is it a competitive advantage for businesses? And I quickly came to the conclusion that it was, because if it were not for some of this diversity infrastructure, some of the resource groups, these voices would have been marginalized. Our voices as African-American bankers would have been marginalized. There would not have been a concerted effort to put a diversity lens on our experience, which was different for a lot of reasons. That I'm sure you'll unpack later on, Dr. Harris. So my informal introduction to diversity happened way back when I was in the 5th grade, in minority achievement, right? But my professional introduction to it occurred with Bank of America. I started to realize the power of the affinity groups and diversity infrastructure, and then had an opportunity at Family Dollar, and you all know Family Dollar was headquartered in our region right there in Matthews, North Carolina, and you also know the communities that Family Dollar serves, right, where they're located and the communities that they serve. But you would have been just dumbfounded that there was no Office of Diversity and Inclusion at Family Dollar. So there was no intentional effort to understand the communities that we were serving. And so I was actually part of the grassroots executive team to launch an Office of Diversity and Inclusion at Family Dollar. And that was the first time that I had formally had a seat in terms of the diversity and inclusion. But it wasn't my full-time job, but it was like, hey, Fernando, in addition to what you do in HR, can you sit on the steering committee to build, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion? And then fast forward to Atrium Health, I was able to join Atrium Health in a diversity and inclusion role later in my career. So long answer, Dr. Harris, but I thought it was important for me to share my revelation that I was probably introduced to diversity and inclusion back in elementary school.
Wow. You've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah.
So, and doing it well now. And I'm grateful for the work that you both are doing. And hopefully it can inform some of what is happening in the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. You both have connections with the conference, Fernando, through your music and membership, lifetime membership at St. Mark's United Methodist Church. And you, Miss Veronica, through Aldersgate. So just giving a little context of what's happening in the conference. So 2016, Bishop Paul Leland arrived in Western North Carolina, and he met with a group of Black pastors and shared his hopes for diversity within the conference. And then those hopes have evolved over the years, and he presented a vision that's now referred to as the Comprehensive Plan of Equity. And in 2018, Bishop Leland invited me to share in planning and preparing for a more permanent administration of this plan. So this vision has emerged and continues to evolve in the conference alongside the larger culture that is engaged in discourse of diversity and race relations in the business sector, in government, military, entertainment, sports, education, other arenas. So the conversation is ongoing, and the West North Carolina of United Methodist Church is joining in with the large United Methodist Church. As Pew Research reports back in 2014 that the United Methodist Church was 94% white in a city like Charlotte that would be, we don't look like our community. So the efforts and the vision that Bishop has for West North Carolina, including areas like Charlotte and other areas throughout the state, is for me invaluable. And while this is happening, the conference and the larger culture has experienced some advances in the conversation, in the discourse, and some pushback in the discourse in the pursuit of diversity. So given that context of Western North Carolina and the larger culture, I want to start with the larger culture, then come back to Western North Carolina. And I heard some of it while you were sharing your stories of how you engaged in the diversity industry. But why is it that we need diversity officers? How do we get where we are, where we need to have diversity officers?
Thank you for that question. That's a great question. I think to me is you need somebody to fully strategize and drive the cultural, changing the culture of an organization. Like Fernando said, when he was a Family Dollar, he said, part of his job, they wanted him to be part of building the new Office of Diversity and Inclusion. When you give this role to somebody else in HR, to me, it can become an afterthought. And you forget the intentionality that needs to happen each and every day. So to me, that's really first and foremost what's mostly important is it needs to be somebody's priority to continue to drive the work of diversity, inclusion, and equity without having it to be an afterthought. But it needs to be in every meeting, in every agenda. It needs to be the way that we make decisions for our organizations.
Yeah, I agree with Veronica. And, I think I have just 2 points. In addition to what she said, I would just add that we cannot ignore, Dr. Harris, that there have been a series of systemic decisions that have been made in our country and in our communities that have unleveled the playing field. And for a lot of reasons, there have been systemic racially based decisions around hiring, systemic racially based decisions around who can get an education or who will be funded an education, systemic decisions around who will be given a mortgage, and so all of that. We call those terms social determinants, and we tie them to like access to healthcare and things like that. But I mean, those social determinants, in my mind, demonstrate that the playing field is not level. And so I always liken it to the picture that I saw where, there are these 3 kids that are trying to go watch the baseball game. And they're all they want to do is look over the picket fence and see the baseball game. But one of them is 4 feet, one of them 5 feet, and then one of them just got a basketball injury and was on crutches. They all need different types of support to be able to see over the picket fence. Right. And all they want to do is just see the game over the picket fence. And when you see the picture, you see that there were different things done for them so that they can see the picket fence. I call that equity. That's the work of equity, and so that's why diversity and inclusion and equity is still needed. And then I'm also, a business major, so I know the importance of the bottom line. And I also know that diversity, equity, and inclusion gives corporations, gives our churches, gives all organizations a competitive advantage in terms of productivity, how they serve, and their bottom line, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I do want to add one quick thing. I love your the visual about the fence. So think about when we add justice to the equation, well, how can we remove that system, that systemic racism? And that can be that fence.
Yeah.
So how can we go about removing the fence? So we looking into providing equity, but then, the justice piece of it, how can we also be part of removing the fences and part of dismantling a lot of the systems that have been put in place?
Yeah. Great point, Veronica.
Great point. I love that. I've seen the visual too, and that does disturb me that even while they're lifted up and they can now see, they're still on the other side. So yes, remove the fence and make it so that they can sit in the bleachers and make it so that they can play on the field, make it so that they can be a part of what's going on. So yeah, I love that. Thank you for adding that piece. Yeah. So and thank you too for Fernando for offering the business perspective, the bottom line competitive advantage, because that's one of the things I'm wondering how some of the most successful corporations, some of the materially successful corporations, Walmart, Amazon, Apple, they all have initiatives that address diversity in their structures. And so the bottom line, how is it that bottom line is affected by having more diversity in the structures?
Yeah, so we just studied that, Dr. Harris, at Atrium Health, because, there is a business case required to have a diversity, inclusion, and equity metric on your scorecard. And when it's on the scorecard, that means it's tied to people's compensation. It's tied to their performance, so that's a big deal, right? So you've got to be able to show that there is a reason, there's a business case for it to be there. And so when we did our research, we found that high-performing companies, such as the ones that you just mentioned, realized a more innovative product development solution because they incorporated inclusion into their product development. Therefore, their products are received better in the marketplace. We saw that there was better productivity within the workforce because the workforce felt a sense of belonging and inclusion, and they were tied to the mission, vision, and values of the organization. So that positively affected productivity. There was also, in those companies that embrace diversity, a workforce and a leadership that reflected the communities that they serve, or reflected the customer base that they serve. And so if I can see me in your workforce, and even better in your leadership, then I'm going to have some customer loyalty. I'm going to patronize more. I'm probably going to be a loyal customer. And so all of those things manifested in the high-performing organizations that were intentional around their diversity, inclusion, and equity strategy, and were intentional about holding themselves accountable. So they went past the rhetoric, Dr. Harris. They went past the narrative, and they held themselves accountable. And then the results showed in their bottom line performance.
Wonderful. I'm leaning in. So I noticed the same thing at Aldersgate. And I invite all of us United Methodists who are listening to please visit the Aldersgate website. And hopefully whenever this COVID lifts, that we'll have an opportunity to spend some time engaging with Aldersgate. But on the website, there's many references to diversity. And I wonder if your experience is the same as what Fernando has offered, or if you have anything to add to the competitive advantage.
Absolutely. And Fernando nailed it. It's holding people accountable. I always talk about, I was doing a national conference yesterday for Leading Age. And I talked about how a strategic plan will look beautiful on paper, but if you're not holding anyone accountable to it, it's just going to be that piece of paper, right? There needs to be the accountability, the intentionality. And for me, these companies really just, the companies that were mentioned, they understand the global impact of diversity. They understand the global impact of inclusion, and they have seen it in their ROI. They have seen it clearly in their return on investments, on how their successful initiatives and strategies around diversity, inclusion, and equity continue to grow their bottom line. So it's very, very aligned to the business case. Fernando talked about their business case there. Well, here at Aldersgate, there was a business case made to hire me. They talked about it to the board and said, how is this the right thing to do and the smart thing to do? So build a business case around why is diversity, inclusion, and equity important to our organization, and how is it going to help us grow, and how it's going to help our bottom line grow. But at the end of the day, you're really putting an emphasis on the people that are here working and those who you serve and those in the community, because there's nothing more beautiful than the folks that you serve look like you.
Absolutely.
And Dr. Harris, if I could just add to that, and I know I emphasize the bottom line, but because we're a healthcare organization, people's health, hope, and healing transcend the bottom line, right? So we also have to understand that health equity plays a role in our diversity and inclusion work, and acknowledging where there are disparities. That's why we were very intentional. And Pastor, thank you for allowing St. Mark's to play a role in addressing the disparities from COVID-19. We saw that there were a higher number of cases in our African-American communities and our Hispanic communities with the COVID testing, with the COVID positive cases. And so as an organization, it was up to diversity and inclusion to call out those pronounced inequities and then bridge the resources so we can do something about it. So you know what that led to, Pastor. We had the roving test sites. We actually, if you couldn't get to be tested, we brought the testing services to you. And our church was one of the major sites there where we had one of the biggest turnouts and was able to service the community. And we, in essence, flattened the testing disparity in the Charlotte community with that service. So that's also an important part of our work in healthcare.
Wow. That's an interesting metaphor, and I'm still working it in my head, but I think I'm going to try to use it to help with my next question. This roving model. So if our church, and we all have interest and love for our United Methodist Church, particularly in West North Carolina, if it's 94% white and our communities are not, is there a process such as a roving that we can do, that we need to, or that we should do, in order to flatten that difference? And before I get to that, so let's hold that question on the how, and let me put a why to that. So why should the faith or religious communities have an interest in diversity and equity and justice and these things that have given a competitive advantage in corporate structures? How does that relate to faith structures?
Pastor, I'm passionate about this question because the importance and the criticality of us coming together as a nation in 2021 is so important. We just had one of the most divisive political processes that we've seen. And regardless of who won the election, there were 77 million people that voted for one person and 72 million people that voted for another person. That's evidence that we were divided in that. And my hope and my faith in terms of bringing us together, to be honest, lives in our faith community, because I feel like the influence that our faith community has is our best chance at showing that we are better together than we are apart. And so that's why I believe the why is that it is time for our faith community, the United Methodist Church, to step up and say, we worship united. We are better together than we are apart. And however we can demonstrate that through our practices, through the diversity of our clergy, through the diversity of our worship, through the diversity of our ministries and who we're serving, that's going to be the way that we can bring our country back together. That's just my personal opinion.
I agree with you, Fernando. I truly, truly think that, and I'm not a Methodist, but I am a Christian. And I truly believe that our faith communities, our churches can be the bridge that unites us. There is so much, I don't like using this word, but sometimes I just feel like there's so much hate that our churches can just sprinkle kindness, and together we can and we shall overcome. And like you said earlier, I feel like I've been here 22 years. This is the most divided community I've seen in my 22 years in the US. And it's been hurtful. It's been absolutely hurtful, but I truly do have a lot of faith in our faith communities that they can be the bridge to unite us, but also to go even farther. How can the United Methodist Conference, how can they start driving anti-racist policies within the organizations to really cascade down to our churches and to communities like ours who have benefited for many, many years and who continue to have a very close relationship with the United Methodist?
Wow. So I'm gonna get to the how, but you guys, you both pushed on something that I want to push a little further: the divisiveness of where we are as a larger culture. So there have been, at the same time, this movement of diversity in industries and sports and entertainment and other arenas. But at the same time, there's a sense of a division within some of these communities. So what's the source of the dissonance, and what do we perceive is some of the pushback as to why there are some that don't prescribe to this increased diversity? And then what would be you said the sprinkling of kindness that would help for them to understand that we shall overcome together? How can we package that?
I think one way that we can look at it as a faith community is it goes back to the Bible and readings of, how we are created equal, that we are, and all the amazing readings that we find in our scriptures. So if we lead with that and nowhere, and I'm probably here out of the three of us, the least expert on the Bible, but I'm pretty sure with everything that I've read, I never saw that anyone should be treated less because of their color of their skin or their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And disabilities, different abilities, and all of that. So really driving the conversation from the pulpit, having these conversations together as a congregation of saying, who are we and what we stand for? And to me, that's very important. I know that the church that I go to, and Fernando is very familiar. I still go to the same church. I go to Steel Creek Church of Charlotte. And we have those conversations. When the country is divisive, we come together on Sundays and talk about our divisiveness and talk about what we can do as a congregation to reach out to one another. I know our pastors often say, give somebody who doesn't look like you a call, or go have coffee with somebody who doesn't look like you. But I truly believe that it starts with dialogue. And when it comes to the church, that dialogue, that it's embedded in the scripture.
So can I just piggyback on what Veronica said around the conversation and the power of a conversation? I have realized that creating safe places for people to have the conversation and to be able to say, this is my reality, this is my truth. It helps people have revelations about themselves and about maybe some of the unconscious biases that they've carried throughout their life, maybe the blind spots that they've carried that they didn't realize. I will tell you that we at Atrium definitely, particularly right after George Floyd's death, we made it known that this was a safe place for you to bring your whole self to work and for you to have conversations about what had just happened. We tried to provide the framework for it and tried to make sure that our leaders knew how to facilitate those conversations. But in those conversations, which I was just blown away, we demonstrated 3 of them virtually, Pastor, and I was thinking maybe 100 or 200 people would dial in, voluntary, because you got to meet people where they are. You can't make them go, but you just said, on all of the calls, we had over 1,700 people to dial in to those calls, to listen, to really understand, to let their teammates speak their truth. And then what that did was organically, it prompted other conversations throughout the organization. And then I get emails from people saying, these conversations have uncovered blind spots that I've carried for years. These conversations have helped me to subscribe to the anti-racism movement around not talking about this could have been intentional because maybe I was supposed to be frozen in inaction. Like making racism feel like a slur and for you to be uncomfortable talking about it also complements the behavior of you not doing nothing about it. You see what I'm saying? So now that if we, to Veronica's point, if we open up the conversation, what people are realizing, and I got this one email and it was so powerful. It was from one of our white female leaders. She said, Fernando, I now realize that I have the privilege, and I think she was speaking to her white privilege, but I have the privilege to make a difference in someone else's life. And so for her to type that to me and to say that by virtue of the seat that she sat in, that was powerful to me.
Sure. So do you think there's a shift that has occurred or has to occur between policy and something that's more organic? And what I mean is, I know at some point we talk about bringing in the diversity officers to be intentional about calling accountability and maybe making policies and structures. But as you say, you can't police or make structures so that folks become anti-racist. But what does that shift look like, or what can that shift look like if that is something that I'm hoping for, just imagining, or is that something that is possible and can be a reality?
I think it's what Veronica said earlier, like it's building an accountability plan around what are going to be your practices, your procedures, your strategies and tactics that elevate social and racial justice and that eliminate any of the anti-racist behaviors or practices that may have existed before. So I think you got to be intentional about saying what those are going to be, and then have an accountability place or accountability mechanism to hold yourself accountable to do it. What would you say, Veronica?
I agree. It has to have accountability, but also a lot of intentionality. Fernando, you and I know that this work doesn't happen overnight, that a lot of implementations, not everything goes perfect, but it's that trial and error and getting back up and keep trying that's going to make a difference. Just because you tried something and it didn't work out, let's just leave it alone. No, how can we make it better? I also think that one of the important points is to make sure that diversity, inclusion, and equity initiatives are not a program. They're not a program, because when you look at a program, it's in one and done. This needs to be something sustainable. This needs to have strategy behind it, a very strong strategic plan that speaks to the larger organization. So that's the only thing I would add on that regard. But definitely accountability should be the big theme of our conversation today.
And a visual of it, a big visual of accountability. And a lot of times, Pastor, that's just showing, hey, you just mentioned the 94% demographic, right? Show that in a picture. What does that look like?
Yeah.
This 94% demographic, and this is who this is what we look like, but then this is what our community really is. You know, I show that demographic all the time to our senior executives at Atrium, saying, you know, this is the community that we're serving. This is the demographic of the community that we're serving. And then here's the demographic of our workforce. And then even more glaring, here's the demographic of our leadership team. You know, and so visually showing that, it sort of connects people to, okay, oh wow, what can I do to contribute to that? So I think we need to do more of that, Dr. Harris.
Yeah,
great, wonderful. So we've mentioned a few terms: diversity, inclusion, equity, justice, and sort of how they intersect with one another. Are there any other concepts or terms that we would need to consider in doing this type of work?
I would say belongingness too, because as a church, sometimes, and some people still say this, that church is one of the most segregated environments that we have on Sunday morning. And why is that? You know, are we cliquish in church? Do we have a certain look that we prefer? Or do we have a certain type of service that we prefer? A certain type of language that we, you know, and so I think we have to watch that and make sure that we are being inclusive, and we got to self-check ourselves with that. I even have to do it, Pastor, believe it or not, as minister of music. Just because I might like Todd Tribbett, we can't sing Todd Tribbett every time. You know what I mean? We have to sing hymns, and we have to sing anthems, and we have to sing the spiritual, and we have to, you know, you got to think about belongingness and inclusion in everything that you. So inclusion was one of your words, but I would just also say belongingness and making sure people have a voice, that they can contribute, and they feel like they are just as part of your worship and your ministry as anybody that's been going there 30 years.
Wonderful.
I agree. Yeah.
So as we draw close to a close,
that was quick.
Right.
You can tell we can talk about this for hours.
Great energy, great passion. I'm excited. I'm ready to go and do some of this work. And as I'm thinking about this, and the Western North Carolina Conference is being more intentional about it, in setting up structure and a person in particular. But as I'm thinking about Western North Carolina, there's a lot of diversity type of initiatives that are happening, a lot of trainings, a lot of things that are happening in a lot of different ways. And I think that some of that could be more centralized. And I think that's part of what Bishop's vision is. And as we think of how to centralize it, maybe in terms of structure, but more specifically in terms of the person and personality, what would a conference, a entity of faith, need to be particular about if they were to invite someone to lead an effort like this?
I would just start with having a, like Fernando and I touched on earlier, you know, the first baby steps to me have to be definitely a business case. You know, why are we doing this? Why is it the right thing to do? And why is the smart thing to do? Because people want to see that. People want to hear that. And from that point forward, it's really building that strategic plan that says, what do we want from this? Who do we want to impact? You know, what are the communities that are currently and still marginalized by because they don't feel welcome, or they don't feel that sense of belonging by our congregations? And how can we get to them? How can we go to them? How can we bring them closer to being part of who we are and the future that they're building? So I will also, and Fernando, you know this, we have to do a lot of internal work. and see where we are as a person, because there is the journey of an organization. There's going to be the journey of the United Methodist, Western Conference, and then each person within is going to have their own journey. The journey of understanding, where am I in this picture? Who am I? How am I contributing to the efforts of diversity, inclusion, equity, justice, sense of belonging, advocacy? Who am I in this picture? So really doing some internal work and say, what's in my personal ground that it's either now allowing me to be fully there and continue this work forward, or that it's also making me turn around and say, is this really for me? So I think that both of those, so that business case and accountability, but that internal look of ourselves and say, who am I? Where am I in this picture?
Yeah, I love that, Veronica. That whole point of introspection is incredible. Like, do that inclusive leadership assessment for yourself and uncover your own biases and blind spots, but then maybe invite clergy and the cabinet to do the same thing. Because how can you advance this work if you don't know where your blind spots are? And how can you advance this work if you don't know what inclusive leadership behaviors you demonstrate? So I love that as being part of it, Pastor. And the person in this seat should have permission to conduct those assessments and permission to really explore that. And then they should also have permission to build the accountability plan, to build the visual and put it in your face, not to be the diversity police, but here, I'm just showing you the evidence base. Here's the visual. Here's where we are. How can we mobilize around it? And then the only other thing that I would say is this person should have permission to build an infrastructure that can support the role. So our infrastructure are like the resource groups that Veronica used to lead. We have a resource group for our African-American populations, a resource group for Asian, a resource group for women. Figure out what those groups are and build that infrastructure, not to keep us separate, but just to make sure that there is a voice from our diverse demographic groups that can advise this group. And it's not, again, for division. It's really just to really maintain that whole belongingness strategy and tactic. Wow.
This has been phenomenal. This has really encouraged and inspired me. And I'm prayerful that the conference will hear this with the same ears and be encouraged and inspired as well. I'm particularly encouraged as we go back to your childhoods and the beginnings and the questions, the why questions, Miss Veronica, that you have asked. And I think also informs the introspection that we should have, the why. And Fernando, the conversations that you had early and the conversations that you've continued to have ever since, those conversations, I think, are central and key too. So thank you both for the information, the passion, the wisdom, the expertise. I think that's going to take us a long way in our planning and our development on this diversity, this equity, this justice, this belongingness that you shared, Fernando. This has been great. So any closing thoughts from both of you as we wrap up?
I'm just very thankful. I'm feeling very blessed to be in this virtual room with all of you, and but also, like you said, I'm very prayerful that this work continues, that it doesn't stop here with just a conversation, that it continues, and that maybe this is a conversation that needs to be had, that some folks need to hear to see the beauty that diversity brings to organizations, the advancement that it brings. And if you want to, Fernando and I are both business majors, so then the return on investment. But this work, when it comes from a good place, when it comes from your heart, when it comes with passion, with true passion, it will continue to flourish.
Yeah,
thank you.
I can't really add much more to that other than, anyone that ever asks, what can I do? Whether you're in that 94%, Pastor, or outside of the 94%, I would always say, expect positive change, because if we are in this understanding that we are going to move the needle, that we will be a more diverse conference, a more diverse faith community, however you want to look at it, you've got to believe that something good is going to come from this. If you're in it in a hopelessness or in a place of you don't have hope or you don't have faith, that's not a good place to be, because your behavior is going to align to that. Your behavior is going to align to that. So I would just say, expect positive change, keep the faith. And like Veronica said, this was just an absolute blessing to be a part of this conversation. However we can continue to help with this, please keep us engaged, because we believe in you. We believe in our conference leadership, and we will be praying for you as well.
Absolutely.
All right. I heard an invitation. I heard an absolutely. We got to record it, so we'll be back. We'll continue this conversation. You're a wealth of information, a wealth of insight, so I'm grateful for this conversation and the conversation that will continue with your invitation. So thank you so much, and thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Means of Grace.
Thank you for listening to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. We hope you enjoy listening to these podcasts and use them as a way to stay connected to our community. Remember to subscribe to Means of Grace for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us an honest rating and a review. It helps others find this podcast. Follow the WNCC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WNCCUMC. Once again, that's at WNCCUMC. Means of Grace is produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church and Andy Go of Gojo Studios.